Hi, my name is Holly. I'm a program manager at Edison Ford Winter Estates. And right now I'm in the laboratory of Marie Curie. It doesn't look very fancy, does it? Well, that's the conditions she worked under for most of her life. I'm excited to share her story with you. As a young child, many years ago, I used to read biographies, particularly about females, and I read the story of Marie Curie. Madame Curie, to be quite honest, and it was inspirational. But I learned so much more, and I think you will be even more inspired by her life and her legacy and her story. Marie Curie, pioneer in science. I'm going to give an apology ahead of time if I mispronounce a Polish name or a French name. I apologize. Maria Sklodowska, later known as Marie Curie, was born on November 7th, 1867 in Warsaw, modern-day Poland. She was the youngest of 5 children, so she's the smallest one here. And I will point out that once later on she moves to France, she changes her name from Maria to Marie, the French version of her name. And this is a picture of Marie at 16. Both of her parents were teachers. Her father, Vladislav, was a mathematics and physics instructor. When she was just 10, Marie lost her mother, Bronswalia, to tuberculosis. And this is her with her sister, Branya, in 1886, and we'll find more about her later. But what happens is that her father will lose his job. There's a lot of prejudice against people in Poland at the time because they are under Russian rule, at least the chunk of Poland that they were in. There's also a part that's under the Austria-Hungarian control. But and life for them was very hard. He loses his job and his wife has died and he wants to raise money to bury her. So the money that they had, he invested thinking that it would make enough money, and I'm not quite sure what he invested it in, that he could bury his wife. But what happens is he loses every penny he has, and they are basically destitute. So they had to take boarders in. They take young men into their home so they can even afford to live. And what happens next? Besides losing her mother, Marie loses her faith because her sister dies of typhus in 1876, her oldest sister. And how did she die of typhus? She contracted it from one of the boarders. And then her mother dies of tuberculosis. It's just a combination of things building upon each other. And talk about a woman who there's conflicting information about. Any research I do, including like places that you would think would never disagree, there are some disagreements over dates or events occurring, but the basic story remains the same. By the way, Marie was a brilliant student and received a gold medal when she completed her secondary education in 1883. And there she is with her beloved sister. Because women could not attend universities in Russian-dominated Poland, Marie spent a year in the country with friends at her father's suggestion. After she returned to her family home in Warsaw, the next summer, she began to earn her living through private tutoring. Marie attended a secret school called the Floating University. Today, we might call it an underground college. And they had to change the location all the time because they didn't want to be detected by the Russians. And Russians certainly did not believe in learning anything to do with Poland, but they also didn't believe in higher education for women. It's called the Floating University, and it is changing locations. That university taught things like physics and history, natural history. But that was the university, not the Floating University. The Floating University fills in on those banned subjects of Polish history and culture. And here's a family photo from 1890. So to supplement her education, and they were very strict. The Russian police could show up, start questioning, which it actually happens, make sure you could answer the questions, and you're being taught the proper things in this school. Determined to make a career in science, Marie made a deal in 1886 with her sister Branya, agreeing to pay for Branya's medical degree in France. These are all brilliant students, by the way, by working as a governess. Branya, in return, helped Marie move to Paris in 1891, and she actually has to work an extra year longer than she thought to be able to even afford to be there. So Marie moves to Paris, and she studies at the Sorbonne, which would be the University of Paris, in 1891, where she studies physics and mathematics. And she made ends meet by cleaning glassware in the university's laboratories. Initially, she's going to live with her sister and brother-in-law, but she moves into a form of a very low rent, but also student housing that's for extremely poor people. And she would work late nights in the attic there. And she was so poor because it wasn't practical, by the way, to live where her sister was. It was very far away from Marie, where Marie was taking classes. She was so poor that she had to ration her intake of food. She lived on bread, butter, and tea. On more than one occasion, she collapsed from weakness. Science was her passion, and Marie earned a degree in physics in 1893 and one in mathematics the following year. And these certainly weren't the subjects that females were supposed to be studying during this time. And she would have never been able to continue this if she had been in Poland. I'm going to go just talk for a minute before I talk about Pierre Curie. I want to mention that Marie did have a romance at one point when she was working as a governess in Krakow, and she fell in love with the young man who was a distant relative of her family. And the parents were so anti-working class people, and that she would not have been good enough for their son. And this was a country that was under Austria-Hungary control. I mean, that part, Krakow at the time. So she had had her heart deeply broken at one point. Keep that in mind. The other thing I want to mention is that people will say she was shy. She was shy. And yes, perhaps that was what she was, but I also like to think perhaps she was more just of a reserved person that didn't show her emotion necessarily a lot. And yes, there was times she was uncomfortable in social situations. Well, let's see what you think. She met Pierre, Curie. That wasn't for him. That was for my pronunciation of it. Was a professor at a French technical college. He was 35 years old, and she met him in 1894 through a Polish physicist, Joseph, Wierzas Kowalski. And then she began to work for Pierre as a student in his laboratory, and they later started dating. Pierre proposed that same year, although Marie did not accept right away because she was planning on returning to Poland to work and continue her studies there. But Pierre would write her and convince her to return. And I do think perhaps she also saw that she would not have the same opportunities there. They wrote back and forth, and they were married in July of 1895. And if that is not their wedding picture, it's one of their early pictures. And what I want to mention is that Marie also, if we go back here, you will see, if this is her wedding dress, that she dressed up and wore dark clothes or practical clothes. And for a wedding, I believe she wore a dark blue dress, and she could wear it later on in the laboratory. And for their honeymoon, they both have bikes, and they bike around Paris. And that's how they enjoyed their time there. Marie was always a very practical person and dressed in dark utilitarian type colors and outfits. Well, Pierre only earned about 6,000 francs, which is, this says 41,000, but wherever else I read today, it said it was about 30,000. Basically, it was not a living wage. They're in this area where it's pretty expensive too. And Marie worked for free in his laboratory. And she has studied for an exam that would allow her to teach girls, young women. And here she is with her two daughters. Pierre and Marie's first daughter, Irene, was born in 1897. It was a difficult pregnancy that forced Marie to spend less time in the lab, just as she had begun gathering data for a doctoral thesis. When her mother-in-law died weeks later, after Irene's birth, and of course she was distraught over that, and her mother-in-law was going to care for the baby, her father-in-law, Eugene, a retired physician, stepped in to become on the hands-on parent that people thought Marie should be. And I'm not saying she didn't care for her girls and tend to them when she was home, but she was a woman who was having a career outside the home and not staying at home during that time, which was highly unusual. And this is her daughter, Irene, and this is her daughter, Eve. When their second daughter, Eve, was born, Marie had in 1904, Marie had gotten used to the disdain of her co-workers. People really judged her for not spending enough time in the nursery instead of the laboratory. But she did have her father-in-law who was taking good care of the children. And she would be a part of her children's life when she was home at night. By the way, the same criticism was not leveled upon Pierre because he was a man. So think about the time period we're here and another country. And I have learned a lot here. So let me say, at the same time, the Curies were engaged in demanding research. Each of them had teaching duties. Pierre researched and taught at the School of Industrial Physics and Chemistry. In 1895, Pierre submitted his doctoral thesis, and he appointed a professor of physics at the Sorbonne, University of Paris. Beginning at 1900, Marie had a part-time teaching post at the École Normale Supérieure de Sauvé for girls. At this point, they needed more room, and the principal of the school came to their aid. They could use a large shed, which was not being used. Marie described the shed as having a bituminous floor and a glass roof, which provided spotty protection against the rain. It was like a hothouse in the summer, drafty and cold in the winter, yet it was in that lab, that shed, that they spent the best and happiest years of their lives. And that is from her first Nobel Prize. And that's the website that came from. There, they could devote themselves to research. Sometimes they couldn't do their processing outdoors, so the poison gases had to be let out through the open windows. But one thing I know in the description of this is that there are also some broken windows, and this is the laboratory. This is what the famous Curies worked in. And the floor was pretty rough. My husband tells me that bituminous refers to coal. I don't think it was a coal floor, but I knew that whatever the covering on the floor actually was, it was pretty rough. It's not a place that anybody should have actually been working at. It was hot in the summer, cold in the winter. It was pretty rough, but it was theirs. Interested in the research of Becquerel, a French physicist who discovered that uranium produces rays weaker than X-rays discovered by Röntgen, Marie expanded on his work. So they're both working on the same topic, but they both are working separately, although their research will come together. She conducted her own experiments on uranium rays and discovered that they stayed constant no matter the state of form of uranium. The rays, she theorized, came from its atomic structure. This groundbreaking idea created the field of atomic physics. Marie used the word radioactivity to describe it. And I'm going to be quite honest with you here. My mind is yes, I work at Edison Ford Winter Estates, but I am much better at history than I was at science. But I I will do my best to attempt to explain what she's talking about here. After Marie's discovery of radioactivity, she continued her research with Pierre. And now they're going to come together some. And in 1898, when working with the mineral pitch blende, they discovered a new radioactive element. They named the element polonium after Curie's home of Poland. The Curies also discovered another radioactive material in pitch blende and called it radium. In 1902, they revealed that they produced a decigram of pure radium, which confirmed it was a unique chemical element, which is a big deal. Now, she was working separately, then together with her husband, or they were both focused on the same thing, but separately. But remember that Marie's a woman. What are they going to think about her research? Both Curies were overwhelmed by sickness, burns, and fatigue that in hindsight were caused by repeated exposure to high radiation. And you're going to say, how could they not know that? Well, nobody had made the connection between radium exposure, when they had no protection from it, and illness at the time. They were both resistant to the idea that their research supplies caused their illnesses. At the time, they persevered in not realizing the risk, often with raw and inflamed hands, because they were often handling highly radioactive material. And I just want to mention it, something. Marie and Pierre had been invited to the Royal Institution in Radium, where Pierre gave a lecture. And let me point out, one of these times, they're supposed to be Marie there speaking as well. And I think it might have been this one, and she is not allowed to do it. They won't let her. Trust me, he always advocated for her, but she does sit in the front row, and he mentions her name. But this was not a time when women were considered equal to men, though I think in their partnership it always was. Well, he's there at the Royal Institute in London, and he's showing how radium affected photographic plates wrapped in paper, how the substance gave off heat, and he demonstrates this spectacular light effect in the semi-darkness. And he describes the medical test he had tried on himself. Listen to this. He wraps a sample of radium salts in a thin rubber band and bound it to his arm for 10 hours. What do you think happens? It begins to resemble a burn more and more day by day, so you're correct. And after 52 days he does this, he has a permanent gray star remaining. And that connection, Pierre mentioned by the possibility of radium being able to be used in the treatment of cancer. But this is not why they're doing this research. I have to be honest, though he makes the connection. They are doing this for the sake of pure science. Then they can go from there. Pierre's hands shook so bad that once he happened to spill a little of this, and it was so expensive. And 50 years later, the presence of activity, 50 years later, was discovered on the premises, and certain substances had to be cleaned. Pierre was so ill that his legs shook and he found it hard to stand. He was in so much pain. A doctor prescribed strychnine for them. What do you think about that situation? And the skin on her hands was cracked and scarred. Both of them constantly suffered from fatigue. They were exhausted, but they apparently had no idea that radiation was affecting their health. And remember, nobody knows it at this time. And I will talk about later what happens to their papers if you visit them. But someone else is unsuspecting of this, people who work in this field. All of them. Nobody has made the connection yet. So back to Marie. In 1902, she isolates radium as radium chloride, determining its atomic weight as 225 and 93 hundredths. The journey to this moment had been long and arduous. In 1903, and there they are in the lab, Marie became the first woman in France to earn a PhD in physics. The professors who reviewed her doctoral thesis, and remember, all she's up against as a woman at the time, said that it was the greatest solo contribution to science ever written. And you're asking me, do people think that perhaps Pierre did it? Of course, they were those kinds of accusations. Many people didn't think that women were capable of much. Now, this is their pictures for the Nobel Prize. I realize in profile it looks a little unique, but that's how the Nobel Prize Committee would present them back then. The Nobel Prize in physics for 1903 was divided. One half was awarded to Antoine Henri Becquerel in recognition of the extraordinary services he rendered by his discovery of spontaneous radioactivity. And the other half went jointly to Pierre Curie and Marie Curie, née Sklodowska, in recognition of the extraordinary services they have rendered by their joint research on radiation phenomena discovered by Professor Henri Becquerel. So, and that would have been the pictures that they had of them. So side profile, little unique. So they actually do not attend. And this is what happens. At the awards ceremony, the president of the Swedish Academy, the Nobel Prize Academy, which administered the prize, quoted the Bible in his remarks about the Curie's research. It is not good that man should be alone. I will make a helpmeet for him. Okay, we're talking about science here. We're not talking biblically or personally or anything else, just pure science. And here's the problem. Was Marie just a helpmate? Or no, she was a full partner. And this is something she always faced. Questions about whether or not she actually did her share of the work. If she was a joint partner or was she getting undue credit? So I am surprised that she didn't have a comment about that. Maybe she did, and it was never recorded. They were a team. At the Sorbonne, it was Pierre who got the preferred job. Misogyny was alive and well, folks, then, a full professorship. Marie was not promoted, but Pierre hired more assistants and made Marie the official head of the laboratory, freeing her to conduct experiments for the first time and to be paid for it. It's better than nothing, but still, she was not treated as an equal, only by Pierre himself. They were also awarded the Davy Medal of the Royal Society of London in 1903. And 1905, Pierre Curie was elected to the Academy of Sciences. But guess who wasn't, though she deserved it as well. Tragically, the most successful collaboration in the history of science came to an end when Pierre died in an accident in Paris in April 19th, 1906. He slipped while crossing the street. Some people thought he was lost in daydreams, thinking about his work while crossing, and the streets were wet. And he fell under the wheels of a horse-drawn cart, suffering a fatal skull fracture. I won't go into the descriptions. I've read of this. And actually, they go to Marie's house where her father-in-law was watching the children, and they asked for Marie, and he said she wasn't home, and they leave. Well, eventually Marie gets word, and it's, of course, it's one of the great tragedy of her life. Less than 24 hours after the funeral, by the way, Marie announced her intention to return to work. Women weren't supposed to be returning to work after their husband passed away, and the French government offered her a pension, and she wouldn't have to work, and she refused. She was going to continue her work, her husband's work, and she was going to work in science because that was her passion. Marie began teaching some of his classes at the Sorbonne, and in 1908 she was promoted from assistant professor to full professor. But trust me, she's going to face prejudices there as well, so much so that she threatens at one point to go to the Pasteur Institute, and eventually she will work in a laboratory under the auspices of both of them that they funded for her. And her father-in-law is still staying with the children. They also hire a governess. She was very close to her father-in-law. And I didn't put it here, but in 1910, her father-in-law will pass away, which was a tragedy. He had become ill and he was in his 80s, and it broke her heart and her daughter's heart, particularly her daughter Irene, her oldest child. And what is this newspaper over here? Well, we would call that a rag, a gossip column. I'm trying to think of the equivalent of something that's published today. I mean, it was a gossip column. It was a conservative, right-wing, political, anti-women working outside of the home type of thing, looking to undermine her work and her name. So in 1910, she published a 971-page paper on radioactivity. Some of the scientists still did not consider her an equal. So she applied for membership in the French Academy of Sciences in 1910. And though Pierre had been a member, she was not admitted by 2 votes. I'm going to tell you, I've read 2, I've read 1, I've read 1 or 2. But it doesn't matter, because whatever happened, some places that said that 1 vote was switched to the gentleman that was also seeking admission. Apparently 2 people could not do it at the same time. One Academy member, physicist Emile Amagat, stated that women cannot be part of the Institute of France. Sexism, xenophobia, and that means they're afraid of people from other countries, and chauvinism, alive and well in the snobby French scientific fraternity, conspired to deny her the seat, which was instead given to Edouard Branly. He was a radio pioneer, with the advantage of being more French, more Catholic, and most importantly, more male than Marie Curie. And those things were all important at the time. Devout Catholicism, and by the way, his work was definitely overshadowed by Marconi. And I can't say if he deserved to get in there or not, but do I think that Marie should have? Absolutely. So here's gossip about her life and saying that she didn't earn her honors, among other things. And by the way, Albert Einstein will rush to her defense. Here comes even more dirt on Marie, at least according to the French papers. And Marie is not a person that lives her life in public, by the way. In 1911, rumors spread that she was having an affair with a prominent physicist, Paul Longvon, a man 5 years younger who had been Pierre's student. Paul's wife discovered letters from Curie to her husband and gave them to a tabloid paper. Although a widow in a similar situation may not have faced any repercussions, she found her reputation tarnished. And neither one ever talked about their relationship outside with any outsiders. And here's a quote from her from a Smithsonian Magazine article. "I believe there's no connection between my scientific work and the facts of private life." And they will never comment, and we never know whether it was actually a love affair or a friendship, because they all 3, Marie's husband Pierre also knew Paul. His wife, in my opinion, exhibited some signs of mental illness at different places in the relationship, and some pretty physically and more emotionally aggressive things happen. And things are written about Marie. She'll go to the press. She'll make a spin that Marie is just a danger by her behavior. So keep that in mind as well. The front page news of the perceived scandal threatened to overshadow other news later that year. And this is big. Her second Nobel Prize. She's a woman. She already got a Nobel Prize. Now she's getting another. That is so unusual. This one was in chemistry for the discovery of polonium. In her acceptance speech in Stockholm, so she does go this time, she paid tribute to her husband, but also made clear that her work was separate from his, telling of their separate contributions and describing the discoveries she made after his death. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, as well as the first person to win the award twice. And she remains the only person to be honored for their accomplishments in two separate sciences, physics and chemistry. And by the way, back to that scandal, I forgot to mention that people also accused Marie of being Jewish. There was such prejudice at the time that could be disparaging to her. There was the conservative press and there was the liberal press. They'd say she wasn't French, she was Jewish, she didn't deserve that seat in the academy. And by the way, how does she react to all these things? She throws herself into her work. But it's absolutely horrible what she faced and the prejudice that she dealt with. But think about people in France who were dealing with other types of prejudice at that time. And by the way, at the end of 1911, Marie, she's still working with radioactivity, but she became severely ill. This is 1911. She had an operation to remove lesions from her uterus and kidney, and a very long recovery. In 1913, she was able to travel again, and she returned to her passion. It wasn't another person, man, woman, even her children, though, loved them dearly. My thought is that her passion is science. Now, just one little other thing I want to throw in there. Marie and Pierre never patented their work. So guess what? Other people got to use it for free. They did not think that they should make money off the production process. They thought that research should be carried out for research's sake and not be mixed up with someone's profit motive. And researchers should make their findings available to everyone by supplying their fellow researchers. Keep this in mind. They don't have access to their own work or what they needed because they gave it away. They did not patent it. They were very generous in that way. I wish this wasn't quite so blurry. So Marie is recuperating basically for a couple of years. But in March of 1913, Albert Einstein paid her a long visit. She also opened and led a new research facility in Warsaw. And as she's setting up a second institute in Paris, World War I breaks out. And she has this idea She is going to outfit 18 portable X-ray stations that could treat wounded soldiers on the front lines. She sometimes operated and repaired the machines herself and established 200 more permanent X-ray posts during the war. These medical vehicles had the nickname. They became known as Petite Curie, or for their famous creator, Little Curies, and that's what they were known as. So she made those X-ray stations portable by setting up those ambulances. By the end of the war, it was estimated that Curie's X-ray equipment, along with radon gas syringes she designed to sterilize wounds, may have saved the lives of a million soldiers. But yet, when the French government later looked to award her the country's most important honor, the Legion of Honor, she declined. That wasn't important to her. Marie even tried to donate her gold Nobel Prize medals to the French National Bank, but they refused. So she's certainly not there to do it for money or fame. Just a quick break on this topic for a minute. I wanted to throw in a little connection between Marie and Thomas Edison. I'll have a little something else later on. But what's the connection? Well, Edison works on the fluoroscope. It's kind of like a moving X-ray. And he is exposed to some radiation. But his worker, Charles Daly, definitely was. And tragically, he starts losing body parts and maybe he becomes very ill. I think he's only 37 years old when he died. Clearly, that was exposure to radiation. Well, Marie herself suffers the effects of exposure to radiation, as did Pierre, and maybe even her child. So keep that in mind. They both are working on things to do with the X-rays, and I've always believed that maybe Edison's digestive system had some of the effects of that, though I didn't have the proof, but I do know what happened to Daly, who worked with him. So to skip ahead, eventually Marie, World War I's over, and there's a connection, and she's still working in the lab, and finally she does get a better lab under the Pasteur Institute and Sorbonne, the University of Paris. But the link between Marie Curie and the US would not have been possible without the help of Mary Maloney, editor-in-chief of the magazine, The Delininator. I butchered that, didn't I? In May 1920, Maloney interviewed Curie. And when she was asked if you could make a witch, what would it be? And she said, I need 1 gram of radium to continue my research. Now, she's the one that discovered radium, but I cannot afford it. Radium is too expensive for me. And that is from a website that focuses on Marie Curie and the US. And following this exchange, Maloney launched the Marie Curie Radium Fund in the US, and she raises $100,000 so that money can be used to buy what she needs. And that 100,000 during that time period, the late 20s, would be worth 1.2 million today. To tell you some more, Maloney actually sets up this tour because Marie is going from place to place. Now, her health is still pretty precarious. So there she is with her daughters. Irene up top here, but up over here, and there's Eve. So her health isn't doing well. So some of these stops will be canceled, though she does end up going to DC. She goes to Arizona. She goes to numerous places. But remember, they don't have access to their radium because they didn't patent it, and now it's being used even in cancer treatments. And so this lady is no dummy, and she's the head of a magazine, and she thinks, hey, I can sell some magazines, a human interest story. People will love hearing about Marie. And they're kind of doing a spin on it. And this woman, Maloney, thinks if people will donate, women will donate if we soften her image as a scientist. And this Marie is not, she's a loving mother, but they're going to use the stereotype of no place like home, devoted to her children, and downplay her science role. So they are going to present Curie, her articles, her promoting this as a benevolent healer intent on using radium to treat cancer. Now, that is going to be an outcome of this. But I'm going to be honest, her focus was for pure science. I think I said that once already, but keep that in mind. And Marie knew that radium would be useful in a clinic, but she had no direct role in using it in medical treatments. Does her work lead to this? Absolutely. But that is not her focus. And certainly the way she presented, she is not a warm, cuddly, touchy-feely person. Nevertheless, her motivation was that millions should not die. That was the headlines of that magazine article. She's called the Joan of Arc of the laboratory. And Marie absolutely hates it. She reminded her audience that the discovery, let me just read you something, was the work of pure science done for itself rather than direct usefulness in mind. And somebody else took it there. But just keep in mind, she could have patented it, been very wealthy. She doesn't really approve of this, but it does work, and $100,000 is raised. Marie makes it so today it's worth 1.2 million. And by the way, Marie made numerous stops and received many honors. And it was during this trip at the White House that President Warren G. Harding presented Marie with the gram of radium purchased with the funds that were raised by that campaign. It did allow the Institute to continue its research and achieve significant advances in the field of radiation therapy. And Marie does write to this woman, the editor, and say, you know how careful I am to avoid all publicity referring to my name, and how I should be very grateful to arrange my voyage with a minimum publicity. So she does go to the US, but it's, she has to cancel things. And people love just to assign a traditional female role to her. But she does take that home and work in the lab. And later on, there's more money raised for her. American women, she gets another gram of radium raised by American women. And it was presented to by President Hoover. And she donates that to the University of Warsaw. And at this point, her health is also really going downhill. So she really didn't approve of the spin of the campaign, but ultimately it did get her the radium she needed. And by now she is very, very ill. I did want to mention one other cute little Edison connection here. On October 21st, 1929, well, we are Edison Ford Winter Estates, so I do like to mention them. Henry Ford hosted Light's Golden Jubilee, an event that celebrated the 50th anniversary of Thomas Edison's invention of the incandescent lamp. And Marie Curie, and this is from the Henry Ford's website, verbatim here, that world-renowned chemist and physicist was among the guests. And afterwards, she sent Ford this letter praising him for hosting the Light's Golden Jubilee, which he had planned and carried out so beautifully. And this is November 3rd, 1929. So she definitely does have good manners. And it's kind of hard to read, but I was going to read it to you. Dear Mr. Ford, before leaving America, I want to tell you how much pleasure it gave me to be present at the Jubilee for the celebration for Mr. Edison, which you planned and carried out so beautifully. I hope that Mr. Edison is quite well after the emotional strain of the occasion and that your grandchild is restored to health. Sincerely yours, M. Curie. So Edison was also not, I mean, he would like publicity, but only on his terms. So that is a little different. But he also liked to be left alone at times to work in his lab. I would say they had that in common. I don't know which grandchild was sick, but I know they all are healthy ultimately and live long lives. But I thought that was kind of a cool little connection as well. Now here's Marie Curie, a page from her notebook. On July 4th, 1934, Curie died from aplastic anemia caused by the high radium exposure she experienced throughout her research. Curie was originally buried alongside her husband in Sceaux, a suburb of Paris. However, their bodies were exhumed and transferred to the Pantheon, which is, it's basically a big mausoleum. All her belongings, including household furnishings and clothing are still radioactive to this day. And if you want to view one of her notebooks in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, they must first sign a waiver and put on a protective suit, and all belongings on display are encased in lead to combat the high levels of radioactivity. And I believe a lot of those pages have been scanned. I don't know how comfortable I would be doing that. The other thing is that they found out when they exhumed the bodies, I don't believe, that I've got a couple different answers on Pierre. He died younger. They didn't necessarily encase him in lead. But Marie, at the time, before she was exhumed, was definitely encased in lead. I do not believe that is true anymore, that they think the danger of it emitting from her body, that is past. Irene became her mother's assistant at the Radium Institute while completing her studies. And by 1925, she had received her doctorate, having joined her mother in the field of radioactivity. There, Irene met engineer Friedrich Julio, a trainee in Marie's lab, whom she married in 1926. In 1934, the couple made a major discovery when they figured out a way to artificially create radioactive atoms in the lab. They won a shared Nobel Prize in chemistry that year, making Irene and her parents the only mother-daughter and father-daughter pairs to receive the prize, obviously during different years. Now, they are very anti-fascist. They were worried about Hitler, though that's not without controversy, I believe, because of concerns about Russia and so on. But they definitely were aware of what Hitler was up to at a very early place in history. Also, eventually, they will start working separately. I'm not quite sure the reason. There is a really interesting book I can recommend to you later. I read a big chunk of it, not the whole thing. I read a couple. Anyway, in 1956, tragically, Irene also dies. She doesn't live as long as her mother does. And it is thought that it was because it was what she was exposed to, the radioactivity, the radium she is exposed to. She also was classified as shy. I think her husband, charismatic or something like that. I read shy or maybe reserved and focused, but definitely focused on science. Though she also has children. I'll talk about that. But first, I want to talk about Marie's other daughter, Eve, and she, of course, is known as the beauty of the family. Although Eve earned a bachelor's degree in science and philosophy from the college Svenje, and I apologize again if I messed that up, in 1925, she gave frequent classical piano recitals across France and Belgium. She was very musically talented. And those were intermingled with musical reviews written for publication. So she wrote about the music field, she gave concerts, and she finds great success as a writer. She's a brilliant writer. Perhaps her best known work was Madame Curie, a biography of her mother that she wrote after Marie died in 1934. The book became a huge bestseller and it earned her great acclaim. And I think that there is eventually a movie that comes out, Marie Curie, or Madame Curie, maybe it's Marie Curie, that focuses, has Greer Garson. But even that, and I think it might be based on the book, but even that focuses on her duties as a wife and mother more than as a scientist. And don't get me wrong. I, believe in the value of being a parent. I'm just trying to get you the idea of what she was dealing with at the time. Anyways, during World War II, Eve became a foreign correspondent and traveling tens of thousands of miles to wartime fronts like Iraq, Iran, China, Burma, North America. And she gathered enough material for a second best-selling book, Journey Among the Warriors. And after the war, she goes into humanitarian work. And in 1952, she's appointed a special advisor to the first Secretary General of NATO. And in 1954, she married an American diplomat, Henry Richardson Leboisier, who later became the executive director of UNICEF. In 1965, when UNICEF was awarded the Nobel Prize, it was Henry who accepted the honor on the organization's behalf. And if we stretch it, we could say the fifth person in the family to receive the prize, though it was for the organization he was president of. And Eve does continue her humanitarian work, and she dies at the age of 102 in 2007. We're going to wrap up here shortly. Helene Langevin-Joliot received a doctorate in nuclear physics from the University of Paris. And this is Irene's daughter. And Pierre Joliot-Curie, a doctorate in biochemistry from the University of Paris. And I know the grandson says he was never interested in winning a Nobel Prize, but they both did a lot of research. They are the grandchildren and children of 4 Nobel Prize laureates: Marie Curie, Pierre Curie, Irene Curie, and Pierre Joliot. And her husband, Helene's husband, is Michael Langevin. I've said that wrong. And he is the grandson of the famous physicist Paul Langevin, and was also a nuclear physicist at the Institute. So the man that Marie was accused of having an affair with, her granddaughter, marries his grandson. And guess what? There was another generation, and there they are here. Here's Helene, and there is their son. And beyond that, there's another generation, Eve, who's an astrophysicist. So what's Marie's legacy? She won 2 Nobel Prizes. She did science for the sake of pure science at a time when women didn't do that. Her body was exposed to so much radiation, she died. But 2011, I think they celebrated her second Nobel Prize. But I think women like Marie Curie, they deserve to be celebrated every day. She was definitely a pioneer. Here are my sources. And there's a lot out there: Smithsonian, biography, National Geographic, so many. And there's a book, the last book here I'm going to mention is The Curies of Biography, the Most Controversial Family in Science. Check it out. Ask your local library. If they don't have it, ask them to get it for you in a interlibrary loan. I appreciate your support. Thank you. Bye-bye.